and welcome to our podcast. This is Jennifer Hidalgo, and I'm here again with author Sean Meek to discuss his new book, In the Shadow of the Ark, and how it ties in with the book of Genesis. Sean, I feel like we've talked about a lot of various things in regard to your book, and for today you suggested we should talk more about science in regard to Genesis, because not only is In the Shadow of the Ark about the world before the Genesis flood, it's also about the truthfulness of the Bible. It seems like the Genesis flood is the most mocked story in the Bible by those who say that science has proven it to be untrue. How would you respond to claims like that?
Many of those who like to pretend they're scientists and believe in science, and who like to pretend that the science has proven the Bible is untrue, don't know what science really is. They've either not known it in the beginning at all, or they've ignored it when it comes to that. Because science, while it is very powerful in examining the outside world, nature, is also extremely limited in what it can do. And before we even get into that, we've got to talk about what science actually is. Science is not a single monolithic thing. Science is a technique for investigating the world, nature. And there are three things that have to happen in science before you can do anything with it. First of all, whoever is going to be doing whatever they're going to do, they have to come with a guess. They have to guess about something. Doesn't even matter what it is. But first it's a guess. And any guess is not good enough. It has to be a guess that can be made into what's called a hypothesis. Mm-hmm. An hypothesis is not just any guess. A hypothesis is a scientifically testable guess.
Right.
If it's not scientifically testable, it cannot be considered a scientific hypothesis. It may still be a guess. I mean, I could guess what color your nightgown you wear at night, but that wouldn't be science because there'd be no way to test it except observation, which wouldn't be a scientific test anyway. So there are all kinds of guesses, but not science. And then once you have the scientific hypothesis, then you have to test it. And once you get the results of that test, then you can make up what's called a scientific theory. I've often thought it was really amusing, not very smart of them. People who say, well, evolutionism is just a theory, except it's not. Evolutionism is a story. A theory is a well-tested hypothesis, whatever it may be. It has to be well-tested.
Right.
When I was teaching, I would say, I gave a story once about ants in my kitchen. I just bought the house and there were ants in my kitchen. I did everything I could to get rid of the ants. I mean, I scrubbed that kitchen until it was gleaming. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't go away. Nothing I could do. I put poison out. Nothing would kill them. They just kept coming. Then a few months after I bought the house, I went up to the gutters on the roof to clean out all the leaves because they hadn't been cleaned out for years. Well, when I got just above the kitchen, the leaves had been there so long they had actually mulched into basically what it felt like soil.
Okay.
And when I put my hand there, I was covered with ants.
Oh.
There was actually an ant nest in the gutters of my house. I cleaned out all the mess and rinsed it all out. The next day, the ants were gone and they never came back. So I asked the students, does that prove scientifically that the ants in the gutter make ants in the kitchen? And a lot of them said, oh yeah, sure it does. No, it doesn't. What it does, it gives me a possibility to make a hypothesis about it. So then I said, what would I have to do to test the hypothesis? What do you think I'd have to do, Jennifer?
Left the ants, I guess.
I'd have to put the ants back in the gutter. I'd have put all the materials back in just the way it was, put the ants back just the way they were, and then see if they came back in the kitchen.
Which would be impossible, of course.
Which would be impossible. In practical sense, it would be impossible. But that's what I'd have to do.
Right.
Then I'd have to take the ants back out again, see if the ants went away. And to do it properly, I'd have to put them back in the gutters again and do that several times to see what the results were. After I'd done that maybe 5 or 10 times, then I could come up with a scientific theory about ants in the gutters become ants in my kitchen. I mean, I wasn't going to do that for lots of reasons. I didn't want the ants back. But that's the kind of thing that true science is. It's coming up with a guess, then making a hypothesis, then testing it, and testing it many times to see what happens. Now, scientism isn't like that at all. Scientific just makes pronouncements. The world's billions of years old. Can they prove it? No. People evolved out of lower creatures like apes and such. Can they prove any of that? Not a bit. Not only that, but it's not even capable of making a scientific hypothesis about it.
Right.
They're just statements. They're stories. And that's why there's things like that is just storytelling. Evolutionism is just storytelling. Because when you actually look for evidence of evolutionism, it isn't there. It doesn't exist. And believe me, evolutionists was looking for years for that. And occasionally they found something they thought was proof that evolutionism was true. And one of the most well-known ones was called Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man was found in England about 100 years ago. And it was the skull of a human, the jaw of an ape. There's no doubt about it. And this was advertised around the world. Evidence. Here we got with proof that what happened. Except it turned out somebody had actually manufactured it.
Oh,
they got a real human skull. They got a real ape jaw. They filed the teeth down. They colored all of them brown to make them look old. Then they buried them in a place where they knew people were looking for fossils. And then when the people found the fossils, the people who found them were delighted. But a couple of things about that. First of all, once they found the fossils, they made molds of the fossils, but then they locked them away and wouldn't let anybody look at it for over 40 years. Nobody could test them, nobody could check them out. But when they did eventually get a hold of them, and they actually looked at it, they could see the file marks on the teeth. They could see the brown stain wasn't complete. There were actually little white spots.
So, and I don't know this story, so you're saying they accepted that as truth, and then for 40 years they didn't test it, and then when they tested it, they realized that it was
false.
Fraud? Wow. Okay.
They were so eager for something, anything, to show evolutionism being true, that they just accepted without actually asking any of the important questions. It actually happened in America about 100 years ago. Something called Nebraska Man. A farmer in Nebraska found a tooth. He didn't recognize the tooth. So he sent it to a paleontologist who looked at it and says, well, this is clearly not an ape tooth, clearly not a human tooth, so it must be proof of the in-between creature, the half ape, half human. So after he did this, he advertised it, put it all that, wrote papers about it. It got so big they actually had articles in newspapers and magazines about it, including artwork about how the Nebraska Man lived. Because if you have a tooth, you can't just have a tooth, you gotta have a jaw. They made up a jaw.
Okay.
You can't just have a jaw, you have to have a skull. They invented a skull. You can't have a skull, you have to go body. So they made up a body. But you can't have one Nebraska Man. There has to be a whole group of them. So they made up a whole group, the whole society of Nebraska men, including families and how they lived. And the whole thing was based on a tooth that later turned out to be the tooth of a pig.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't even an extinct pig.
Huh.
It was just a tooth that had fallen out of some pig at some point in the past. And the paleontologist was so eager for proof of human evolutionism, he just accepted it, didn't bother to check it. But that happens a lot when it comes to evolutionism and scientism and the rest, because they're storytelling, not doing true science. Because if they did true science, they'd have to throw evolutionism out immediately, because it's obvious that what we see here is designed. Now, you can say it's designed by nature through natural selection, but that doesn't answer the question, how did this stuff get there in the first place? How did the DNA ever evolve on its own? Because DNA is an extraordinarily complex structure, and it doesn't work at all. There is no value to it until it's complete. But evolutionism says things are supposed to work a little bit, and then they get better, work a little bit, then they get better, but DNA doesn't work at all if it isn't complete.
So humans are so eager to prove a point, to believe in something, because to them, they just can't accept anything other than, I guess...
The other alternative is a creator.
Right.
And again, the problem is there isn't even being a creator per se. Some of them might be willing to accept God as creator, but what else is God? Is God just a creator? No, he's not. God is also a judge. Because God has rules. He has standards. He says, do this, do this, do this. We call them the Ten Commandments, but that's only part of it. The Ten Commandments are just part of God's moral code. It's an important part. It's the center of it, but it's only part. But if you have a moral code, then you have a code you can fail at. You have a code you can be judged by. And who wants to be judged? Seriously, who wants to be judged? None of us really want to be judged. We don't like it. At times, God can be very inconvenient. And having a moral code is one of those times. and they don't like it.
So although science is a powerful thing, it's also limited.
Limited. In fact, when I was speaking at church a few years ago, I was out with the pastor having lunch, and we got talking about science and what it can do, what it can't do. And it's offhand, it wasn't even something I was even trying to make a point about. I just said, science, it has never been scientifically proven that smoking causes cancer. And when I said that to him, he was shocked. He was truly, genuinely shocked.
I am too. What do you mean by that? Exactly?
Science has never proven this. No, it doesn't. It has never proven it scientifically. What have they proven is statistically. Statistically, if you smoke, you're more likely to get cancer.
Okay.
That's only statistics.
Right.
It's not science, because science would have to be able to do the same thing over and over again to get the same result. Think about gravity. You hold the ball in your hand, you let go of it, and it falls down every single time. You can test gravity anytime you want. Just hold something up and let go of it. It's always going to go down. Mm-hmm. Well, with smoking, it doesn't work that way. Someone could smoke for 50 years and have nice pink lungs. Someone else smokes for 10 years and their lungs look like the inside of a coal mine. So what's the difference? They haven't figured that out yet. Mm-hmm. There's obviously a difference between the people, even though the same smoke goes in. But so what is it that smoking does cause? I don't doubt for a moment smoking causes cancer and lots of other bad things. Mm-hmm. But it's never been scientifically proven.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
It's only been statistically proven.
Yeah, that's right. That is statistics, not.
That's
not
that's statistics.
Interesting. Okay.
Is not science.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if you want to test an antibiotic, what do you do with the antibiotic? You put it in a petri dish full of bacteria. If all the bacteria drop dead, you can, but you don't even stop there. Mm-hmm. You do it again,
right? And
you do it again, and then after that, you have to go and find all the side effects and such. But you still have to prove it even works. But you just can't put it in someone and say, okay, did you get better? That wouldn't prove it. You got to scientifically prove it if you're going to get that approved for being used in public by the FDA and the rest. Mm-hmm. But that's a scientific proof, not a statistical proof. And so that's what they found about smoking. Statistically, there's no doubt smoking causes cancer. Scientifically, they have proved it. But that's the difference between science and statistics in this case, right, or science and storytelling. Mm-hmm. And again, evolutionism and the things related to it are just storytelling, because they cannot come up with a scientific hypothesis about evolutionism. They can't even come up with a hypothesis, much less actually being able to test it to see if it's true. All they can do is find lots of dead creatures, fossils of dead creatures, and say, well, this must have come from this one, because look how similar they are. In fact, they used to have if you probably saw this when you were in school in a science book, what they call the horse series of evolutionism. You remember the horse series of pictures? Started with the little tiny horse, you got to be the bigger horse. Mm. What they don't tell you is not only did the size of the horse change, mm-hmm, the number of ribs in those creatures changed. Mm. Everything about the creature changed from one creature to another. They just made up that list out of fossils. They had absolutely no proof that one had ever turned into another. In fact, the only creature of that whole horse series that's alive is a modern day horse.
Okay.
All the rest are extinct. So they can't even test that. All they can do is look at the fossils and say, well, it must have been this way. What else could it be?
Right.
Well, it could be those creatures were just creatures of their own. They had nothing to do with anything.
Why do you think that people disprove or try to disprove, or science, I guess, that the flood didn't happen? Or I've even, they've broken it up into two floods. When there's even historically, I would think that so many people have agreed that there was some type of catastrophic flood on
flood
the
event. Yes, stories. There are over 200 flood stories around the world in all different cultures,
and not just Judeo-Christian.
No, there's one of the oldest ones. It's called the Gilgamesh epic. It's about this was set in Samaria, and the Sumerians told a story about a time when there was a good man and a lot of bad people, and the gods wanted to get rid of all the bad people, so they told Gilgamesh to build a cube. And the thing about this is they built a cube, but a cube wouldn't be able to stay in the water, because what happened is a cube would get turned over, and the cube would start spinning around the water when the water was moving. Mm-hmm. Whereas the ark was built like a barge, and barges can take a lot of activity without turning over. So even the story doesn't make sense, but it is the same basic story
Right.
about a good man and a lot of bad people, and that God's punishing the bad people by saving the good one. And then there's an even more better known story than that, and that's the story of Atlantis. Now, you've all heard of Atlantis. Everyone's heard of the story of Atlantis. But what most people don't realize is Atlantis is the flood story. It's also not a Greek story. It's an Egyptian story. A man named Solon, around 500 BC, went to Egypt just as a tourist, basically, and he heard the story of Atlantis in Egypt. Took it back to Greece, wrote about it, and then years later, hundreds of years later, one of the people read his book. A man named Plato read Solon, and Plato thought it was such a great story, he put it in his writings. And then years and years later, when they started reading a lot more Greek, they read Plato's story of Atlantis. And so they thought it was a Greek story, but it wasn't. It was Egyptian.
Yeah, I always did think it was Greek until actually one of our podcasts earlier, I think we discussed that some.
But again, think of what the story of Atlantis is. A lot of very bad people but able to do great things. And a few good people. And then the God or gods, whichever who's telling the story, wants to get rid of the bad people, save the good people, so he has a good person make up some kind of a boat. I forget what the exact boat was, but something like that to float in. And then flooded Atlantis and drowned all the bad people. Now, people like to talk about Atlantis being a city. Atlantis wasn't a city. It was a culture. It was a place. In fact, when I speak about this in churches and schools, I ask them, do you know where Atlantis is? Because I do know. I know where Atlantis is. Or at least where it was. I shouldn't say where it is, where it was. And you're standing on it. Tennessee was part of Atlantis. But so was Germany. So was China. So was Australia. Atlantis was a pre-flood continent. And it was seen as one place because in the beginning there was just one continent. And so when the flood came, not only was the flood a lot of water coming, it was a lot of seismic activity, lots of earthquakes, volcanoes. The earth was literally torn apart.
And would they not call that, is that what they would say is Pangea?
They would have called it Pangea. It was one name for it. And Lemuria was another one. They had several different names for it, but it all comes to the same thing. One single big continent. And then the flood came, and the flood was not just, it wasn't just water falling out of the sky. It was the earth being torn apart. So it'd never be the same as it was in the beginning. In the beginning, one big continent, one big ocean.
Right. And I guess what another big topic of this, of course, is the age of the earth, which I know you could.
Yeah, the age of the earth is a big deal because a lot of Christians want to pretend the age of the earth doesn't matter, but it does matter very much.
Well, how do you determine the age of objects and that sort of thing? Is there
a technique that evolutionists use? Yes. One of the most commonly known ones called carbon dating. Now, what is known is this. In the atmosphere, there's something called carbon-14. That's not what you want to breathe. I mean, you don't want to breathe in carbon-14. You want to breathe in and use carbon-12. That's the stuff that's in wood. That's the stuff that's in coal and on oil. It's carbon-12. That's the stuff you can actually use as a fuel. Carbon-14 doesn't work that way. And when you breathe in and out, you're breathing out carbon-12 with your oxygen. That's carbon dioxide. It's carbon-12 holding on to oxygen-2. That's why it's carbon dioxide, CO2. One carbon, two oxygens. But carbon-14 is different. Carbon-14 is a very unstable element that gets into everything that's living. Everything that's living takes in carbon-14 at some point. And then when something dies, then carbon-14 automatically, and this is completely automatic, turns from carbon-14 into nitrogen-12. And it takes, if they've tested this is one of the things they can't actually test and be certain about, it takes about 5,700 years for half of carbon-14 to turn into nitrogen-12. So here's the idea. If you come up with something that's half carbon-14 and half nitrogen-12, that must be 5,700 years old, because that's the half-life, right?
Yeah.
Does that sound reasonable? But it's totally false. Because here's the question. How much carbon-14 was there in the beginning and how much nitrogen-12 was there in the beginning? Suppose when the thing died, it had 60% nitrogen-14 and 40% carbon, and 50% carbon 12, 14, and 40% nitrogen 12. And then over the next years, then carbon 14 let off and became nitrogen 12 until it was 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
At that rate, it would only have been about maybe 1,000 years, not 5,700 years. Because they're assuming, and this is where the problem comes in with all age measurements, they're assuming it starts at 100% what they call the mother material, which in this case is carbon 14, and 0% the daughter material, which is nitrogen 12, what it turns into. They're assuming that, but there's absolutely no way to know for sure if their assumption is correct. If all their assumptions they make were actually correct, then they could say with some certainty, yes, if it has 50% carbon 14 and 50% nitrogen 12, then it is 5,700 years old. If they knew with absolute certainty that it started at 100% and 0%, but they don't. They just assume it. Now, with the other one, those are things that have been living.
Okay.
But things that are in the recent past. But if something was alive a long, long time ago and becomes a fossil, then they have to use what's called radioisotope dating.
Okay, right.
It's the same idea, except in this case it's uranium and lead. Uranium will naturally turn into lead, automatically. And potassium will automatically turn into argon. It's a natural thing. Now their half-lives are in the millions of years. So they'll say, well, if it's got 50% uranium, 50% lead, we know for sure it's millions of years old. But they don't, because they don't know how much was there in the beginning. Suppose there was only 1% difference between what happened in the beginning and what's happened today. Well, then it might be a few thousand years old, whatever the it may be. And so they do that. But here's the real dishonesty of so many evolutionists. When they find a fossil and they take it in to have not the fossil itself, fossils cannot be dated by any method. When they take it in with a bunch of rocks that were found near the fossil. And they date the rocks, because you can only date rocks, you can't date fossils. And so they do, and they put them in, and they'll do a dozen different testing methods. Radioisotope, there'll be uranium, lead, potassium, argon, and lots of others. There's others they can do too. And then when they come up, they'll come up with a dozen different dates. A single group like that could have dates of anywhere from 100,000 years to 2 billion years out of the same samples, depending upon which test you run. So what do the people who order the test do? They take the date they wanted it to be in the first place.
Yeah.
If they decided this fossil has to be 50 million years old, they'll take the one that's closest to 50 million. And then when they publish their findings, they'll say, we tested the rocks around it, we found the rocks were 50 million years old, so therefore the fossil must be 50 million years old. Even though their dates are completely wildly off on that. And they know it's dishonest, they do it anyway, because they want their story to sound plausible.
Right.
And as long as it sounds plausible, they're okay. That's okay with them. They don't mind.
Well, it sounds like, Sean, it takes more faith to believe in science and be an atheist than it would just be to...
not to believe in science, but scientism.
Scientism is true.
And to be an atheist, yes, it does. Because you have to believe in things that are actually impossible. I mean, you are far more complex than this building. But how many people believe this building got here by itself? Looking at the building, you know immediately the building was designed. Someone designed it, someone built it. It didn't happen automatically. And yet you are far more complex than this building. Or you're more complex than any man-made creation of any kind. Whether it's a rocket to the moon,
right,
or anything. It doesn't even matter what it is.
Well, that's probably a good place to end too, because when you just discuss the rocket, because science, it's so powerful, but yet it does have limitations.
Extreme limitations.
So as long as, you
for instance,
have one without the
science
other.
could never tell how old you are.
Right.
The only way to know that is historical records, what you call your birth certificate. But that's historical record, not science.
Well, Sean, thank you for your time today. We'd like to remind our listeners they can go to your website, shadowtheark.com, in order to purchase In the Shadow of the Ark. and to please share our podcast with your friends and family. This podcast is available wherever podcasts are distributed, such as iHeart, Apple, and Spotify.